We'll then take a deeper dive. Welcome to Module 2. In this module, we're going to take a deeper dive into the underlying economics of innovation and technological change. While these are not necessarily disruptive, we're going to walk through some industries that have been disrupted by various innovations. We'll then take a deeper dive into some of the underlying drivers and underlying economics that we see. Next, we'll introduce the idea of a competitive life cycle and how competitive life cycles help us understand the coevolution of competition and innovation. We'll spend some time talking about the liability of incumbency, why incumbent firms sometimes struggle to survive when faced with
Chơi làm thế nào để cho ăn vui? Chơi làm thế nào để cho nó vui?
Incumbency can be an advantage, not just a
Nhưng mà anh cứ yên tâm ta ăn
We'll
kêu.
talk about the notion of appropriability, about how important it is to understand
Vui gì nữa à?
who wins when these disruptions take place.
Mình lớn bằng đấy mà mình không biết chơi với em
Last
à?
but not least, we're going to spend some time analyzing competitive life cycles.
Chơi mà để cho anh
Providing
không
some
thét lên,
tools
hắn nghiến
so you
răng
can
như
map
giữa.
out how to think about where you are in the competitive life cycle for your company's industry or for your company's products. When we think of digital transformation, there's a tendency to think this is a new phenomenon, something in the last few years that has started to impact business. But the fact of the matter is digital transformation in one form or another has been around for at least 50 plus years. Take, for example, the watch industry. Swiss watchmakers for centuries were one of the leading makers of mechanized watches, experts at little gadgets and wheels to make those finely tuned instruments. And then along came digital watches in the late 60s. Japanese manufacturers such as Casio took over the market, and the Swiss watchmakers struggled in the wake of this new technology. Now, the good news in this story is that they re-emerged in the 1980s, emphasizing style and design, leveraging the new technology. Consider another example, typewriters. For over 100 years, typewriters were a dominant technology in offices throughout the world. Remington typewriter in particular was the market leader in many industries and in many markets, having 80% market share, for example, in New York City. Then along came the IBM Selectric in 1962 and then word processors in the 1970s. And by the 80s and 90s, Remington typewriter goes out of business. Interestingly, IBM was also a maker of typewriters, going back to their roots as a maker of business machines. They pivoted to computing and obviously were an early leader in personal computers. How about photographic imaging? Kodak was one of the world's best firms, a market leader in film production. And then along comes digital, and Kodak went bankrupt. Now, that seems like a simple story, but interestingly, Kodak saw this company coming and actually, as early as 1980, began investing in the digital transformation, yet they weren't able to make the transition. On the other side, we had a company like Nikon, who also was a leader in cameras on the film side, but saw the transition coming and was able to make the transition by emphasizing their expertise in lens manufacturing. How about telecommunications? We saw the rise of cellular technology in the 1990s, and this ushered in a quick rise and fall of a number of different companies like Motorola, Nokia, BlackBerry, Palm, each vying for the evolution of this technology. But it really wasn't until the iPhone came along that we had a true game changer that redefined the dominant design in the industry and led to a competitive shakeout. Let's take something else, bookstores. Bookstores historically tended to be local enterprises around a community. Then came in the 60s and 70s larger companies who tried to roll up the market, companies like Borders and Barnes & Noble. And then we had obviously the internet and online sales and Amazon rising triumphant and many of these companies going out of business such as Borders. Similar type of dynamic we saw in record stores here. Independent record stores giving way to big box stores like Circuit City. Then in the late 1990s, we see the rise of first Napster and various types of digital file sharing, then digital distribution pioneered by iTunes, and then yet another disruption with streaming services like Pandora and Spotify. This has had an impact not only on record stores and retailers, but has fundamentally changed the business model for musicians, producers, record labels, and it's also fundamentally impacted how we as consumers consume music, taking an industry in which we might all listen to the popular songs on the radio to now each being able to get on demand the music we desire, whatever our specific tastes or niche that we fill. Similarly, we've seen dynamics in the entertainment industry, and specifically movie rentals, where a company like Blockbuster was the leader in North America on movie rentals, had 60,000 stores in their height in 2004. First came along Netflix with a DVD by mail business model, then came along streaming and on demand, and the long and short of it, Blockbuster now has gone bankrupt. It's interesting to note that while Blockbuster wasn't able to make this transition, Netflix actually made a significant transformation from being a DVD by mail business to being one of the leaders in streaming and online demand content. So there are some companies who are able to make these transitions. We can think more broadly about retailers. Take Sears, for example. Sears was the leading retailer for a good part of the 20th century in America. They had what was called the Bible of retail, was their wholesale catalog business. Then came first Walmart, who leveraged technology, information technology, to innovate the supply chain. And of course, later Amazon, who really innovated across the whole customer experience around online retail. Sears is still in existence today, but it's a shell of its former self. Take livery services, taxis, limos. Uber and Lyft have entered those markets and fundamentally transformed them. What's interesting to me about this story is they're leveraging mobile technology for sure, but they're not necessarily changing the fundamental technology. You're still getting into a car and going from point A to point B. Using media, using social media, they're able to redefine the experience for users and create new value and disrupt the market. Last but not least, let's talk about automobiles. Automobiles have had a century of stability where internal combustion engines have been the dominant technology, and we've had a fairly stable set of players who've been dominant within that industry. Now it's being disrupted by electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. We're seeing entry by companies like Tesla, Google, Uber. We're seeing transformation of companies like BMW and Volvo who are being heavily invested in electric and autonomous vehicles. It's hard to say how this will play out, but the interesting thing is we know a lot about, in general, how these types of disruptions play out over time. So let me just end by saying here that in the World Economic Forum of 2016, they called this type of digital transformation the fourth industrial revolution. And what we see is that the rise of new next-generation digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, robotics, they are all promising to perhaps accelerate digital transformation even more. Now, while this transformation promises to be even more disruptive to existing business models and markets, this also creates an opportunity. Each disruption creates an opportunity for new business, for new markets, for new innovation, and those are available not only to upstarts and new entrants, but also for established businesses as well. So partly what we're going to do is think through how you as a business can survive and thrive in the face of these disruptions.
Wow, wow.
Digital transformation has the potential to disrupt numerous markets and industries. But this disruption should not be surprising. Disruption is nothing new. In fact, disruption is arguably a natural product of market economies. Joseph Schumpeter, way back in the 1930s, referred to the gales of creative destruction. While other economists were talking about the efficiency benefits of markets, how demand and supply get balanced out in markets, Schumpeter was interested in the disruption potential of markets. In particular, he saw this disruption as a hallmark of market economies. It leads to new innovations, to new technologies which better the quality of life for humans. It's this birth and renewal, he argued, that are really what's important for our market economies. So in this sense, disruption shouldn't be feared, but rather it should be embraced as a good thing, an opportunity for bringing in new ideas and new technology. Now, there are many different types of disruption out in the marketplace. Probably first and foremost, when people think about disruption, they think about technology. So think again about digital watches. Digital watches were a fundamentally, radically different technology than what came before it, which were mechanized wind-up watches. While one was based on minute workings with springs and gears, the latter was about electronics and dealing with quartz technology. Similar, digital cameras replaced film-based cameras. Film was really almost a chemical industry in terms of its roots in science. Digital cameras come along and they're more of an electronics industry. So once again, these are both examples of radical changes in the fundamental technology within an industry. Now, disruption doesn't have to be about changes in technology. Rebecca Henderson and Kim Clark at Harvard Business School have referred to what they call architectural innovations or architectural disruptions. Take the Sony Walkman as an example. The Sony Walkman came about not with any fundamentally different technology. They were really just utilizing existing technology that existed in different types of cassette players and the like. But they redefined the form by shrinking it and making it a portable player that you could wear on your side while you're walking around or going for a run. So while the underlying technology didn't change, the value proposition and the way they organized it did change very much. You might also think about what we sometimes call business model innovation or business model disruptions. Take Airbnb. Since the dawn of civilization, people have been renting out their homes or renting out for others to use their homes. Airbnb comes along and they leverage technology as a way to create market efficiencies in there. And as a result, redefine the market, redefine the value proposition, and create new opportunities for others to participate in those exchanges. Zipcar is another example of redefining a business model. Rather than a traditional rental car model where you go to the rental car agency and rent your car, they create a world in which you can walk on the street, put in a code, and enter a car and use it for a couple hours. Once again, leveraging technology, changing the business model. We might also think about disruption from the consumer side. There are high-end disruptions like the iPhone, which came in with a completely different set of features at the high end of the market, arguably 3-4 times the expense of some of the other phones that were on the market at the time. You can also imagine low-end disruption. One of my favorite examples of this is the Nintendo Wii. We had two dominant players leading up to that, in Microsoft with their Xbox and Sony with their PlayStation. Then comes the Wii. Both Sony and Microsoft were competing on the idea that the winner would be those who offered the most highly technical new gaming system, the one that had the most processing power, that allowed for the most sophisticated games. Nintendo came in with arguably a much technologically simpler machine, one that cost a fraction of the cost of the other players, but had an innovative game control that allowed them to do some creative things with games that resonated with the marketplace. So it entered in at the low end and then ended up disrupting the whole market, and in that generation became the market winner. You might think of Wikipedia along the same way. Wikipedia is arguably not of the quality of an Encyclopedia Britannica, but its new model of using crowdsourced information allowed them to have a very low-cost entry, obviously a free entry for usage by individuals. While it didn't have necessarily the same quality, it still provided enough value that it could penetrate the market and take over large parts of the encyclopedia market. Many times when we think about disruption, we might think about new market disruptions. Once again, the word processor disrupting the typewriter industry, the automobile redefining transportation and putting harm to the horse-drawn carriage industry, smartphones redefining whole sets of different industries, including cameras, mapping, and maps, and the like. And last but not least, you might think about various types of value chain disruptions. One of my favorite examples of this is Craigslist. So Craigslist really innovated around classified advertising and how that's delivered. Yet this had a huge impact over the value chain to newspapers. Now, while Craigslist wasn't competing directly with newspapers' primary income stream came from the selling of classified ads. So a disruption in one part of the value chain ended up in Craigslist. So Craigslist really innovated around classified advertising and how that's delivered. Yet this had a huge impact over the value chain to newspapers. Now, while Craigslist wasn't competing directly with newspapers' primary income stream came from the selling of classified ads. So a disruption in one part of the value chain ended up impacting a whole nother industry and another part of the value chain. Digital transformation has the potential to be disruptive in many different ways. Dave Rogers of Columbia University talks about 5 domains that we should particularly pay attention to. The first is data. Data is now ubiquitous in a world of social media and mobile technology. We have huge amounts of data that are available to consumers but also to companies to leverage to advance the products that they offer. Take Waze, for example. Waze is an app that leverages people's cell phone data to determine when there are traffic jams, and also uses social media to allow users to express maybe the traffic jam is due to an accident or maybe it's due to some debris on the road. By leveraging that data, they're able to create unique value, and that we see across any number of different sectors. The second domain we want to think about is innovation. In a world of a digital economy, we're seeing the ability to do quick testing with innovation in ways we've never been able to see before. This is speeding the innovation cycle and allowing companies to run real-time experiments with their products and run prototypes in a very inexpensive way. Take Facebook, for example. They're able to offer new features and new offerings on their platform in a way that allows them to experiment and learn in real time. The third domain we want to think about is competition. One of the truisms of digital transformation is it often eases entry by other players within an industry. Because of that, we would expect increasing competition in any number of domains where digital transformation is having an impact. One of the things this does is it starts to blur the boundaries between different industries. Companies that were once partners are now increasingly rivals. One only need to look at Google and Apple and Amazon as they increasingly compete in various domains within the larger digital technology space. The fourth domain that gets impacted is ultimately the value that's created for customers. And what we're seeing are new ways to deliver value in creative ways leveraging digital technology. Take Uber, for example. Once again, leveraging social media and leveraging mobile technology to offer a new value proposition to customers looking for traditional livery services. Last domain, customers. The customers themselves are evolving. The ubiquity of information allows customers to be highly informed. It also seems to tend to allow them to be less loyal than they were in the past. Take Best Buy. Best Buy suffers from the fact that many customers will come to their stores, sample their various products, and then, even while in the store, pull out their cell phone, look on Amazon, and purchase the product then and there. So customers are becoming more sophisticated, and they're becoming less loyal to their home brands and products. What this means at the end of the day is that the old sources of competitive advantage are largely disappearing. Things like natural monopolies formed through resource scarcity, while they're still important today, and the old adage in real estate that location matters here is still true, but in many industries, place and space are becoming less important. The obvious example is retail. As retail goes online, those positional advantages, those geographic advantages, become less and less important. Another area of traditional competitive advantage under threat is scale, or economies of scale. The idea that the more production you have, the lower your production costs, and that can provide you a competitive advantage. What we're seeing is that scaling in a digital environment can often be quite easy and quite costless to scale. Think about Facebook. Facebook went from 2 guys in their Harvard dorm room to $1 billion business in a matter of a couple of years. The ability to leverage digital platforms to scale your business and scale your technology are greater than they've ever have been before. A third area, which was a traditional source of competitive advantage, were learning curves. This idea that over time, as you learn to deal with a new technology, you improve your understanding of it, and that in and of itself can be an advantage over others. And while clearly learning curves still do exist, the ubiquity of information provided by the internet and other data sources is making those learning curves less and less pronounced and allowing others to catch up relatively quickly by having access to valuable information on how to deliver, let's say, a new product or service. The fourth thing that we want to think about is vertical integration. So historically, large industrial companies might vertically integrate as a way to create value, but also serve as a deterrent to others trying to compete with them in their marketplace. Well, digital technology is making it easier and easier for people to disintegrate the vertical supply chain and specialize in different components of it. So now you see things like contract manufacturers. Those are really interesting. To give an example from my experience at the Darden School, we see, for example, student entrepreneurs who historically, let's say, developing a new product, a new physical attribute, would have to figure out how to manufacture it, how to get access to distribution channels. There was a lot of capability development that was necessary for them to bring a product to market. Now they can go online, contract with a manufacturer in China, use online as a distribution channel, never actually touch the product that they're designing, yet still have massive distribution potential throughout global markets. And this really highlights a broader impact that digital is having, which is that as digital becomes more ubiquitous, transaction costs start to drop. So transaction costs are those costs incurred when you have parties selling goods and services. This is everything from contracting that needs to take place to even things like transportation of goods and services. 20 years ago, the biggest companies were largely in the same industry doing the same thing. Today, smaller players have the opportunity to disintermediate that value chain. Take the financial services industry. What you see is it's not being disrupted as a whole. It's not like someone is entering in and trying to compete head to head with Bank of America across all their different businesses. No, rather what you're seeing are companies like PayPal, Venmo, and Bitcoin all entering in and taking various pieces of the overall financial services pie. This is what we call fintech, and fintech right now is really having a disruptive potential in the broader financial services industry. So we want to think about 4 underlying drivers that try to drive digital economies and have this disruptive potential. The first one are network externalities. Network externalities are very simply the idea that a good or service might improve in value as others consume that good or service. The classic example is the telephone. Having to be the first person to own a telephone is not very valuable. Who are you going to call? As others begin to buy telephones, the value to you of owning a telephone starts to go up. Let me give you a more recent example, Facebook. As more and more people use Facebook, the value to you goes up as a consumer who uses Facebook. We see similar dynamics, for example, in operating systems. As more and more people use the same operating system, it makes exchange easier, also makes it more likely to develop other apps and software for that operating system. And it's for this reason you see companies like Microsoft dominating in the personal computer industry and a battle going between Apple and Google in terms of mobile operating systems. And this leads to the second point, winner-take-all markets. These various network externalities that we tend to observe in digital economies tend to create winner-take-all markets where there might be one dominant player within an industry. Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple have all in various ways leveraged network externalities to create, in essence, quasi-monopolies where they have advantages of a winner-take-all markets. Now what's interesting is these 4 players that I just named are also increasingly competing with one another. And this relates to my third driver of digital economies, which are platform technologies. The internet is the prime example here, an underlying technology that has great value across a wide number of sectors and allows different companies to plug in different ways. Mobile is very similar, cloud computing as well. All are examples of platform technologies. Now, of course, this isn't limited just to digital. If we think about the automobile and the advent of the automobile 100 plus years ago, it had a similar impact in the sense that a whole set of suppliers and services grew up around the automobile industry to support that. And it's interesting to think as the automobile industry goes through a disruption again through autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, that we might see a similar kind of shift in the underlying platform technology that will give rise to a whole number of different players and business models in that space. The fourth thing we want to think about are complementary capabilities. Complementary capabilities are other ways of delivering value. In a world in which we have network externalities and winner-take-all markets and the emergence of these platform technologies, the way in which you might need to compete is by offering some specific capability that allows you to leverage these platforms to your advantage. Perhaps it's manufacturing capability or a great customer service that you provide. But you're going to need to find that specific way in which you can uniquely deliver value given these ubiquity of these different platforms and technologies. So in summary, when you think about digital transformation and potentially the disruption it might have on your industry, you want to think about these underlying drivers and how they might impact ultimately the way the industry evolves and how you might compete. Digital transformation can be scary, but the good news is we have seen and observed common patterns of how transformation and disruption impacts industry over time. This results into what we like to call the competitive life cycle. Competitive life cycles are similar to the idea of a product life cycle, but they're viewed at the industry level rather than the individual product level. The first observation we have with the competitive life cycle is what we call the S-curve. The S-curve refers to the common pattern in sales or revenues that we see over time. Early on, things are being figured out about a new technology or an emergent industry. Eventually, hopefully, you hit a sweet spot where the technology takes off, and that's the steep part of the S-curve. And then eventually, maybe you tap out the market, and that S-curve starts to curve off as you maybe hit a sustainable level of sales. So we think about cumulative revenues, we'll see this S-curve over time. We could break that S-curve up into a set of phases. That first phase, where people are still learning about the technology and it hasn't quite diffused yet, is the emergent phase. Sometimes the emergent phase can take decades to occur, as we're seeing, for example, in electric vehicles, which actually had existed even back at the earliest stages of the automobile industry. In other industries, the emergent phase can happen relatively quickly or quite quickly as a new hot technology comes into the market. The second phase is the growth phase, and this is the sweet spot of the S-curve, where we really see a lot of growth in sales. And then eventually we enter into a mature phase, where again, growth starts to decline, we reach a more stable level of sales and a lower level of growth within an industry.
Này đang là thời điểm các trường đang chuẩn bị kiểm tra đánh giá giữa học kỳ 1. Đây là một trong những bài kiểm tra quan trọng có kết quả ảnh hưởng đến việc đánh giá cuối học kỳ và kể cả cuối năm học. Vì vậy, thu hút được sự quan tâm từ phía học sinh và cả nhà trường. Tại những nơi học sinh còn học trực tuyến và học qua truyền hình, việc kiểm tra đánh giá sẽ khó hơn so với những nơi học sinh học trực tiếp. Theo hướng dẫn của Bộ Giáo dục và Đào tạo, các trường có thể triển khai nhiều hình thức kiểm tra đánh giá mới thay vì chỉ kiểm tra trên giấy như trước đây. Điều cốt lõi là làm sao đảm bảo chất lượng và tính khách quan của công tác kiểm tra đánh giá trong tình hình hiện nay.
Dạ vâng, học sinh lớp 4 của trường tư thục ở Hà Nội đang tập trung làm môn kia, chuẩn bị cho bài kiểm tra ở nhà. Ngoài là bài kiểm tra theo hình thức truyền thống, các giáo viên có thể giao bài thực hành và dự án học tập cho học sinh để lấy điểm dự kỳ như thế này.
We can also think about three different phases that a technology goes through: annealing, shakeout, and disruption. So let's talk about annealing. Annealing is this idea that over time there'll be a coalescing around what we call the dominant design of the technology, basically figuring out how will the technology look moving forward. Shakeout refers to what happens to the number of competitors within the industry. So let's look at that. If we turn our attention to the number of firms within an industry, we very often see the following pattern. Early on, a few intrepid entrepreneurs or incumbent firms enter into the industry. As the market starts to grow and take off, others come in as well, seeing a market opportunity. More often than not, we eventually get over-competition, too many players within the market, and we get a shakeout occur, in which we see firms either going out of business or firms merging and acquiring with one another, limiting the overall number of firms within the market. Now, one of the interesting questions is, how severe will this shakeout be? We've talked before about winner-take-all markets. In a winner-take-all market, obviously, we're left with one last standing firm. In other industries, they might support multiple firms within the market. So one of the things we want to think about is, what's the likely outcome of this competitive life cycle for this particular industry that we're interested in? Last but not least, we want to think about what happens with margins. Margins are probably the most questionable piece of this, in that there's a lot of variability. In many industries, early on, margins might actually be negative. In fact, there might be no profits being made within the industry. But hopefully, as the industry starts to grow, we'll see margins improve. But as we discussed before, we also see increased competition. And as that competition increases, it's often the case that margins might get compressed. Where they end up, well, once again, that's an open question, and there's lots of factors that we can discuss that will impact whether this is a profitable industry or not. So to give you an example, here we have some data on the automobile industry. And what you see here is that automobiles in the late 19th century begin as an industry to take off. And we see massive entry by hundreds of different competitors within the industry. Then over a roughly 20-year period, we have this competition ensuing that eventually leads to a shakeout. In the United States, we were left with what we called the big three auto manufacturers of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And we saw similar patterns in other countries across the world as well. And then that structure dominated for decades after that. Here's some data on the beer industry. Very similar dynamics. In the mid-1880s, we start to see the emergence of mass-produced beer. That led to a massive entry by lots of different beer manufacturers, and then we see a competitive shakeout as well. And again, this was replicated in markets across the world. So overall, we have this idea of a competitive life cycle evolving over time as revenues increase and follow an S-curve, as we might see a shakeout, and then this open question about margins within the industry. So let me give you an example here. Think about the market for digital music players. We had in the mid-1990s an established industry of portable CD players led by Sony and a number of others in that marketplace. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the iPod, but the iPod in fact was not the first entrant for digital music players. That honor goes to a company called Rio, who was an entrepreneurial startup within the industry. There were then hundreds of others who offered products, including the Microsoft Zune, Dell, HP, many others who came into the market with their own digital music player offerings. The iPod was actually a relatively late entrant into the industry, but when it did enter, it established what we call the dominant design. It became the dominant form factor that we would see within the industry. Now, it's interesting to note that the iPod itself was effectively disrupted by the iPhone just a few years later, as many of those music functions were incorporated into our smartphones. Note that the iPod established what we call the dominant design. It became the dominant form factor that we would see within the industry. Now, it's interesting to note that the iPod itself was effectively disrupted by the iPhone just a few years later, as many of those music functions were incorporated into our smartphones. And in fact, now the iPod is a very small part of Apple's overall sales. So the competitive life cycle is a common set of patterns that we see across many different industries, and understanding those patterns are going to be very important to try to understand how digital transformation might impact your industry. We've previously introduced the idea of the competitive life cycle. Let's take a deeper dive into how the competitive life cycle often unfolds. Early on in the competitive life cycle, we have what we might even refer to as the era of ferment. This is the idea that early on, things are largely exploratory. Innovation focuses on different product features and different underlying technology that might eventually become the dominant form within the industry. It's at this period we often see small entrepreneurial firms entering in the industry, in many cases pioneering the industry. And to the extent that profits are made, they're often made more through differentiation and niche placement than they are through, for example, a low-cost structure within the industry. So let's refer to the automobile, and particularly the automobile industry 100 years ago when it first emerged from the remnants of the carriage industry. When the automobile industry first appeared, we had lots of different competitors, hundreds of different competitors, in fact. We saw incumbents moving into the industry. Studebaker brothers, in fact, were the largest, most successful makers of horse-drawn carriages in the United States, having upwards of 60% market share in the United States. They saw this transformation occurring, and they made investments to make this transition into the automobile industry. We saw others come from examples like the bicycle industry. Many other just entrepreneurs who were interested and got into the industry. What was fascinating about the early phases of the automobile industry, there were lots of different drivetrains within the industry. We had the Stanley steamer using steam power. There were actually numerous electric vehicles early on in the automobile's history. There were kerosene-powered engines, and of course, there was the gasoline internal combustion engine, all competing to be the dominant technology within the industry. Now, over time, what we typically see is a dominant design start to emerge. We see not necessarily one technology, but in many cases, a limited number of technologies emerge that become the dominant form factor we see within the industry. Now, as we see this occur, innovation begins to shift from innovation and experimentation around different form factors to things like manufacturing, processing, delivery, service. And this is where a shakeout typically occurs, where we might be left with just a few large, efficient firms. And interestingly enough, many of the pioneering firms might actually wither away. Think again about digital music players and the Rio. So it's not guaranteed that being the first mover, the first entrant into this new technology or new industry is going to guarantee long-term success. So let's go back to the automobile again. So eventually, as we all know, the gasoline internal combustion engine becomes the dominant technology. It's interesting to note this might take a long time. In fact, even as late as the 1930s, 1940s, there were electric vehicles throughout different cities throughout the world. In New York City, they actually had a fairly significant market share for delivery vehicles. But over time, we eventually settled into the internal combustion engine being the dominant technology. It's interesting to note that it's not necessarily that the best technology wins. In fact, there's lots of factors that might drive why one technology dominates over another. In the case of the automobile industry in the United States, eventually companies like Ford would enter in and compete more on efficiency of production, for example, through the assembly line process, than it was necessarily through the innovations of the technology of the automobile itself. Eventually, we were left in the U.S. once again with the big three of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. General Motors in particular was interesting is that they in essence rolled up the industry through acquisitions. They bought up a lot of different players to create the General Motors company. All the while, other companies were going out of business. Studebaker brothers made a good go for it for a couple of decades, but they eventually are now a footnote in history and have gone away. So when we think about this process, we eventually want to think about the renewal of this process to a new disruption. So once we reach that dominant design and the market matures, this actually creates the seeds for future disruption to occur. That disruption might be exogenous. It might be driven by a technology change, what we sometimes refer to as technology push. It could also be driven by the market itself as consumer preferences shift, what we often call demand pull. The same S-curve that we talk about in terms of cumulative revenue, we can also think about in terms of technology performance. And it's often the case that there are some potential even physical limit to how well the technology can improve. So let's turn our attention now again to the automobile example. We're in the midst of another disruption in the industry driven by electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. This after nearly 100 years of stability within the industry. Why is this occurring now? Well, we can speculate. One is underlying advances in the technology, the technology push concept here. Some of it driven by digital transformation itself, making these technologies more viable. Some of it also is being driven by consumer demand. For example, consumers demanding low emissions vehicles, leading to the prevalence of electric vehicles in the market. We see obviously a lot of incumbent firms competing and offering vehicles along these lines, but we also see new entrants like Tesla making significant inroads. In fact, by 2017, Tesla actually had a higher market capitalization than General Motors, meaning basically that the market thinks that Tesla will be a larger, more significant player in the future. We see companies like Volvo, an established player in the market, pledging to go all electric by 2020. So once again, we don't know how this will exactly play off, but we have a pretty good idea. We'll probably see entry into the industry. We'll probably see competing pledging to go all electric by 2020. So once again, we don't know how this will exactly play off, but we have a pretty good idea. We'll probably see entry into the industry. We'll probably see competing designs here in terms of what the dominant design technology might look like. And we'll probably eventually see a shakeout and a coalescing around a common form factor for the industry in the somewhat near future. So again, diving into the details of the competitive life cycle gives us a greater understanding of how competition unfolds when we have these disruptions taking place. Innovation or technological change can be quite disruptive to the current competitive order. If we think back to our idea of S-curves, what you might see over time are interlapping S-curves as new technologies emerge. Often these new technologies might be worse at first, but as they improve, they will overtake existing technologies. Now, that's not guaranteed. In many cases, the technology fails to ever overtake the old, but in some cases it does. And what's interesting about this is in many cases when this occurs, Older firms that can adapt are basically driven from the marketplace. So this raises an interesting question that if this type of change can be disruptive, does it have to be fatal? Why is it that so many incumbent firms struggle and some of them die when faced with a disruption? So let's start with the question of why do incumbent firms often fail when faced with these disruptions? The first argument is very simply, they're no better positioned than new entrants when a new innovation or technology comes along. In essence, the innovation renders existing capabilities valueless, either technologically, organizationally, or market-wise. We go back to Swiss watchmakers. They were really good working with small, mechanized devices. And now comes along a new technology, and that whole expertise they had was rendered useless in this new digital world. So as a result, they were no better positioned than new entrants, and lots of new entrants could come in and potentially do better than them. Second, they could actually be worse positioned than other entrants in the industry. Incumbent firms might actually fail to see the value of the new innovations and have a difficult time adopting. This is what is sometimes referred to as core rigidities. The idea being what made you successful in the past, what might have been your core capability, actually becomes a core rigidity as the industry shifts because you're unwilling to make the change. Think about Borders. Borders had made a huge sunk investment in terms of their physical brick and mortar stores that they had established throughout North America. Along comes online book sales. They might have falsely thought these sunk investments needed to prevent them from making a heavy investment in online. Take Kodak, for example. Kodak, once again, was very aware of the emergence of digital technology. Yet over the preceding decades, where they were trying to make this transformation, they always seemed to be just a step behind. Maybe one of the arguments for why they struggled was they were basically a chemical company. All of their talent, their resources were around chemical engineering and the like. And now they're making this transition. And that's very hard for a company who had such success to suddenly make a bold transition to a new technology or industry. Let me give you one last example. General Motors, back in the 1980s, tried to reinvigorate their ability to create small, energy-efficient cars, especially given the competition they were receiving from Japanese companies like Toyota and Honda. They created their first new car division in decades called Saturn. Saturn early on was very successful. They started from scratch. They did a whole number of innovative things. They got out of Detroit, they built in Tennessee. They had new labor relationships with the unions. They even had an innovative way of selling cars that didn't rely on haggling. And early on, Saturn was a big success. But then, over the coming years, the Saturn vehicles really weren't improved at all. In fact, they were the same cars 10 years in as they were basically when you originally could buy a Saturn. What happened? Why did General Motors stop investing in their Saturn platform? At least the argument that some have made was that it was an internal political battle. Chevrolet and other divisions starved Saturn of resources that they were concerned were cannibalizing their products. Now, I'm not sure if this is exactly what happened with the Saturn case, but it's an example of how political infighting sometimes exists in large corporations, and once again could make them actually worse positioned than new entrants during a technology shift. The third thing we might want to think about is that in some cases, firms might simply select not to change. Maybe there's a fundamental trade-off between the long-run competencies they need and the short-term advantages that they have. Maybe they're worried about cannibalizing their existing products. Take Blockbuster, for example. Carl Icahn, the activist investor, argued that Blockbuster shouldn't try to make the transformation to be an online streaming business. They had no inherent capabilities there. And it was better for them to take their resources and basically milk the cash cow that they had, which was their retail stores, until they basically went out of business. Planned obsolescence. Now that's very hard for companies to do, but it can be the most logical response when you get disrupted. So let's flip this around. We just gave you a whole set of reasons why incumbent firms fail. Why do incumbent firms succeed? What is the ability of these firms to thrive when there's disruption? Well, first, innovation might require extensive capital and expertise. It might require R&D and the like that only a large incumbent firm with resources is able to handle. Maybe small or newly founded firms simply don't have the expertise that are necessary. Think about IBM and their Watson technology. They were able to pivot in the late 1980s into the early 1990s from basically becoming a hardware computer manufacturer to being more of a business analytics company, leveraging higher level digital technology like artificial intelligence. They were able to take that inherent technology advantage they had, built up over decades of experience, and pivot into a more lucrative and more promising piece of the competitive marketplace than others would be able to do. Sometimes customers simply desire assurance from established firms when new markets are emerging. Maybe the customers are risk adverse. Maybe they're unwilling to try new things, or they just like the assurance of an established brand name when they move into a nascent market. It's going to be interesting to see in the electric vehicle market how BMW and Volvo do. Two well-established brands, well-respected brands, that are becoming more aggressive into the electric vehicles. Whether they'll have an advantage, perhaps over Tesla or other startups in space, is an interesting question to have. Even though these companies don't have the history, Tesla and the like, than these companies have. Third thing you might want to think about is that sometimes incumbent firms may leverage some type of complementary resource or capability to their advantage. Think about Nikon in the camera industry. Once again, they were able to make the transition to digital by emphasizing their lenses. They were able to use this technology and this advantage they had in understanding lenses to survive once this transition was taking place. In BMW's case, perhaps it's their manufacturing service capabilities that will allow them to survive and thrive in a world of autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles. Again, leveraging existing capabilities to succeed in a new marketplace. The fourth and last thing we might want to think about in terms of why do incumbent firms succeed is that perhaps the incumbent firm has somewhat what we might refer to as a dynamic capability. Basically, the ability to adjust to changing business conditions. Probably the prototypical example of this in recent years has been Apple. Apple was a pioneer not only in digital music players, but smartphones, and of course they have the iPad as well. They were a well-established firm, though, having roots all the way back to the 1970s. So under Steve Jobs, and especially the second tenure of Steve Jobs, they were able to create a dynamic ability to reinvent themselves in the face of changing market conditions. And in many ways, this is the golden ideal that many companies are trying to achieve when they think about their own innovative capabilities. How do we create the set of capabilities to allow us to be dynamic and responsive to changing market conditions as we might go through a digital transformation? How do we determine who will win in the battle for supremacy during a digital transition? Well, the first observation is those who invent or those who pioneer a market are not always the ones who win a digital transition. In fact, the ones who create innovative disruptive technology is not as important as who actually appropriates value. From them. So let's discuss this in more detail. Consider the following pie. Imagine the area of the pie represents the total value created by the innovation. Now that value is shared by a number of different stakeholders. Of course, the innovator, but also hopefully their customers, creating new value for them, perhaps their suppliers upstream, and also, and very importantly, Other imitators and competitors who might copy the innovation might also capture some of that value from that innovation. So the big question is, how big is the slice of the pie that each of these stakeholders end up capturing, especially the innovator? The reason this is important is because timing is everything. And there are different strategies that different firms might pursue based on their set of capabilities or the nature of the market. In some instances, being a first mover matters, being a pioneer to the market. Think about Amazon and online retail. Being an early mover allowed them to learn a lot about online retail, build up infrastructure associated with that, and become the juggernaut that they are today. In some instances, being a second mover can be advantageous. Basically, let others advance the technology and then come in as a quick imitator, advance the technology further, and dominate the marketplace. Microsoft over the years has been very successful with this type of strategy, in particular with their Office suite. They weren't the pioneer in terms of spreadsheets or word processing, but they were able to take advances and incorporate them into their own products and become the market leader. This brings to mind a classic debate in the innovation literature between exploitation and exploration. Exploitation refers to investing in research and development to incrementally improve existing products and services. Exploration, on the other hand, refers to investments to try to advance the technology significantly, bring about these disruptions that we've been talking about. And so a critical question for a lot of organizations is how much effort to spend on exploitation versus how much effort to spend on exploration. And it's a balancing act for many companies. You could imagine if you spend too much time just exploiting existing technology, you might miss a disruption and therefore find yourself disadvantaged as the market evolves. On the other hand, if you spend too much on exploration, you might not be able to be profitable in the existing world, and then you never survive to the new technologies you're trying to advance. So the question of exploration and exploitation is involved in part by the nature of the market conditions and also the nature of the specific company that you're talking about. So what are some things to think about in terms of who appropriates value? Well, two main areas I'd like to talk about. The first is the strength of intellectual property protection. This is, for example, the nature of the legal system. Do you have a patent on your technology or a copyright on something you've written? It could be more than that, though. It could be something about the underlying nature of the technology in the market. The reason this is so important is that if you have strong IP, strong intellectual property protection, this tends to favor innovators. If you have weak IP, this might favor others, these second movers, these fast imitators who can come in and be very successful. The second thing we're going to discuss are complementary assets. These are the other things necessary to exploit an innovation. Maybe it's marketing or distribution or some other supporting technology like hardware and software. So let's dive a little deeper into intellectual property protection. When is intellectual property protection strong? Well, the first obvious case is when you have these legal protections, patents, copyrights, trademarks. These might vary, by the way, over various countries and various geographies. Some countries are more strict enforcing patents and copyrights than others. It's important to recognize that simply having a patent or a copyright does not necessarily mean you have unassailable rights to it. At the end of the day, you have to be able to fight for it in a court of law. There have been many entrepreneurial firms who've struggled when faced with a patent that they believe is giving them rights to produce something and it is infringed by others, but the person who is infringing has more resources to fight them in the court of law, and as a result, the entrepreneurial company cannot enforce their patent rights that they have. Another way intellectual property can be strong is if there's some form of first mover advantage. This could be things like learning curves. If you get out ahead of the technology, you're innovating it, you move down that learning curve, perhaps you're lowering costs, perhaps you're providing more quality or value. These are things that can, in some instances, provide substantial competitive advantage. Things like loyalty and branding also are examples where, in some cases, being an early mover into a new technology or industry can provide you an advantage that sustains itself moving forward. Not always the case, though, as I gave examples like the Apple iPod, which was a later adopter in the industry, yet was able to come to dominate the marketplace. A third thing to think about is standardization. This relates to some things we've talked about before about network externalities and winner-take-all markets. In some markets here, being the standard bearer, being the one who basically establishes the dominant design, can lock you in to being a strong competitor that makes it very hard for others to compete with you. This is, in essence, another form of intellectual property that gives you a competitive advantage. Fourth thing you want to think about, how easy is it for others to imitate you? If that imitation is slow, that is in essence another form of tight intellectual property protection. Many companies forgo patents and other types of public types of intellectual property and instead use things like trade secrets. Those trade secrets, to the extent they are hard for others to imitate, can be a source of competitive advantage here. Maybe it's because your technology is so complex that others just can't backward engineer it. Maybe it's socially complex, the way you put things together, that even when observed, others can't figure out how you did it. So these would be examples, again, where there might be not legal protection, but yet you're still able to defend an innovation that you have because others just can't figure out how to do that for themselves. Last but not least, in some markets, and this is fairly rare, diffusion among customers may be so fast that even if others can imitate you, you can still capture a large lucrative market and do quite well for yourself, even though you're likely to be imitated as an innovator. My favorite example of this was a fad during the mid-90s called the Big Mouth Belly Bass. This was a novelty product in which we had a plastic fish mounted on a board, and when you walked by it, it would turn and sing a song to you, the height of entertainment. The Big Mouth Belly Bass was easily imitated and was by many others. However, for whatever reason, being a fad, it diffused quite quickly, and the person who innovated the Big Mouth Belly Bass actually made quite a bit of money. So again, fast diffusion in a large lucrative early market may allow you to gain from being an early innovator within an industry. So once again, overall value appropriation, we want to think about the strength of the intellectual property protection. And then the second thing we want to think about is this idea again of controlling complementary assets. So let's talk about that in a little more detail. The first question we want to ask is, well, how important are these complementary assets? And the reason we would like to know that is because we want to know how tightly held they are. So what do we mean by this? For example, if it's a product, perhaps everyone needs manufacturing, but is there one company who is the best at manufacturing or perhaps has the only certain manufacturing technology necessary to bring this product to market? That would provide them a competitive advantage that even if they're not the innovator, they still might capture a lot of value of that innovation. Maybe it's something about distribution or service that allows them to capture a lot of value from the innovation, even if they weren't the ones who innovated themselves. A classic example of this is the CAT scan market, the market for health indicators that use CAT scan technology. EMI was the pioneer of this technology and the first to market, and they had intellectual property protection around some pieces of this. However, it was General Electric, GE, who later entered the market, who ended up dominating it. Why was that so? Well, one of the things GE had as its advantage is that it was already a well-established seller of healthcare equipment and therefore had relationships with distributors and with hospitals that allowed them, once they entered, to do very well, despite not being the initial innovator within the technology. So again, they leveraged their complementary assets to succeed in a marketplace where they weren't the first innovator. So overall, when we think about these competing forces and when you time entry into a market, we want to think about these two forces, the strength of the intellectual property protection and the role of complementary assets, and reflect where we as a company have those various strengths or weaknesses, and that might determine how we might compete in a digital transformation. Given the importance of competitive life cycles to understanding digital transformation, I'd like to provide you with some tools, some ways of mapping competitive life cycles for your business. In my book, The Strategist Toolkit, I provide the following little diagram as a way to think through where you're positioned on various products within the competitive life cycle. Rather than represent it as a series of graphs, here we represent it as a circle, recognizing the fact that often we see renewal and the process begin again as new technologies and disruptions enter the marketplace here. We see our three phases: emergent phase, growth phase, and mature phase, and we see our transition points of annealing, shakeout, and disruption. And overall, we're really interested in how quickly does this process take? How speedy is this competitive life cycle for our particular industry? So let's give an example. Here we have Apple, in particular Apple circa 2011. In 2011, they had just recently offered the iPad. One could argue that the iPad was still in an emergent phase. Maybe we're still trying to figure out exactly what that form factor is going to look like. The iPhone had been offered a few years before. That was more in the growth phase. We had really now started coalesced on what a smartphone looked like. We were in the high growth phase part of the market. We had the iPod, which was entering a more mature phase at this point here. Shakeout had occurred, dominant player in the iPod, but now growth was starting to decline and we were entering that mature phase of competition. And even more mature, we had the Mac product, one that had been around for decades and arguably towards the end of its life cycle as a form factor. Once again, we can now map out all four of these businesses simultaneously, get a sense of where they are. Some questions we'd want to ask. First, how long are each of these phases? Do we expect the mature phase to be decades long, or is this just going to be a matter of a few years? How long is that emergent phase? Is the iPad going to be something that will be emerging for a few years, or will be relatively quick? And again, we can work through each of these different phases. Overall, we might ask, is this a slowly evolving industry, one that might be relatively stable for decades? Or is this maybe on the other extreme what we might refer to as a hyper-dynamic industry, where every 18 months or so, new things are coming to market and transforming the marketplace? We also want to think about the severity of each of these transitions. Are the disruptions more radical in nature or more incremental in nature? When we think about the annealing process here, do we imagine one single dominant design, or will there be potentially multiple competing designs that can still coexist within the marketplace? When we think of shakeout, is this a winner-take-all market? Is this one of these industries, again, where we're just going to see one single winner? Or is this something that's going to be maybe a duopoly or an oligopoly, a small number of competitors? Is this rather going to be a contested market where we have lots of different competitors working to try to be dominant within the marketplace? And overall, we want to think through these questions about, are there first mover advantages? Does timing matter here? Can we wait and be patient and have a second mover opportunity? So again, as we think through this competitive life cycle, it allows us to create a portfolio of understanding of the various products in the market. One could take Apple in 2011 and advance it to 2017. What would we see? Well, most of these technologies now would be moving into the mature phase. That could mean that new disruptions could be coming around the bend that Apple needs to be aware of and maybe investing in the next technology that will disrupt the marketplace.